My hope is that in doing things like these conversational circles and summits for executives, for next generation leaders, that we can build off of these no-brainer ideas that are tiny, they're incremental, but when you stack them together, they create seismic change.
Welcome to the Convene Podcast. I'm your host, Magdalina Atanassova, Digital Media Editor of Convene. It's a pleasure to bring you another episode from Season 3 as we offer an exclusive behind-the-scenes glimpse into Convening Leaders 2024 held in sunny San Diego this January. This episode is brought to you by Visit Kingston. Crafting events and their educational programs strategically is key to sparking transformation. Join me in conversation with PCMA's education strategist, Kristi Casey, as she unveils captivating initiatives and formats from Convening Leaders. Get an exclusive sneak peek into what's on the horizon for EduCon 2024. Enjoy the episode. Kristi, welcome to the Convene Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm starting right away with questions.
I love questions. Go ahead.
I'm starting with the easy one. Can you introduce yourself briefly and share a bit more about your background as well as your responsibilities during Convening Leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Kristi Casey. I am a PCMA education strategist, and that means that I develop ideas for content and programming for PCMA events as well as educational products. My background is actually in performance, so everything from everyday life as a ritual performance and adapting literature for the stage and dance theater. And so whereas that did not have a direct translation to making money, it had a fantastic application in terms of looking at disparate sources of information and creating a cohesive narrative. And so I kind of feel like that was the best training I could have had to develop education and train people for all sorts of careers that haven't been developed yet. From that, I became a writer and worked for a long time with Plan Your Meetings. So I did a lot of different things, which I guess was the business equivalent of my position on the softball team growing up, which was wherever they had a hole, I could fill it. So if it was a great team, then I could play my favorite position, first base. And if it was a weak team, then I'd play shortstop or something else. So I picked up a lot of different things, which have come in handy in terms of looking at the PCA audience and how to help kind of move the educational strategy and products further.
I love that. It's such a varied background. I mean, I did not expect that beginning and that ending. I mean, the ending I know, but the beginning.
Right. Well, before I transitioned out of doing theater full time, I did have a full time job as an improviser. So it having a lot of different responsibilities and thinking quickly and making stuff up as I go along that was not a new skill that I had to learn.
It shows. So what about your responsibilities during Convening Leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came on a couple of months prior to Convening Leaders because we had a team member who was blessed to have two babies right in the middle of the show. And so definitely needed some assistance, somebody who could kind of come in, collaborate on the content, help schedule the content. And then while they were adapting to motherhood, figure out how to all these programs could run smoothly. So my job during Convening Leaders was to ideate, then to source, then to coach speakers, then on site to stage manage the sessions. And there were a couple of sessions that I think we're going to get into, which were a little bit more unusual. They focused on specific groups of business professionals, one of which was the Executive Leadership Summit, and the other one was the Next Gen Summit. And both of those were multi-hour gatherings that were not your typical come together. And those were, I think, my favorite parts of the program.
Absolutely. And I think because they were so special, that's why the focus for our conversation is on them, because I think you sharing more about them can bring a lot of added value to the business events industry, really.
And also too, these are the stuff that we'll discuss now is kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? Because we're working on white papers that we'll be distributing widely to our PCMA members and then to the industry at large. And these also are intended to be the first of a series of conversations that help us identify where we are and where we might need to go as an industry.
So let's dive in. Let's talk about the Next Gen Summit.
Yeah.
What was the vision about the program and how did you organize it?
Yeah. So the vision around the Next Gen Summit was what would happen if we got our under 30 PCMA members and convening leaders attendees together to talk about what they needed to stay in the industry. Because even before the pandemic, event planning was typically in the top 5 most stressful professions in the United States. I don't know how that charts in other countries or if other countries that have a month of vacation even worry about things like that. But in America,
They do.
Okay, good. Yeah, because so in America, like you've got firefighters, you've got emergency room nurses, and then you have event planners. It's stressful. And your position within the hierarchy is also not one that tends to get a lot of praise or recognition. So, on top of being stressful, people think of you as being order takers and they don't understand the strategic value of your event. So, consequently, this is an industry that regularly comes under attack for a variety of reasons. So, we had the pandemic where all of the live events were canceled because it was a health risk and nobody saw that coming. And then prior to that, we had a great recession and companies tightened their belts, and so all travel was canceled and they didn't want to. And before that, or as a side component of that, there was some extended scrutiny on the money that companies spent on events. And prior to that, it was the incentive industry that was under attack. And are these junkets? And what's the value of spending money on our salespeople? And so this is something that is not new to the industry, but every time it happens, we're surprised. And what it all has in common is that people who plan meetings and events are not considered, for the most part, valued contributors whose work contributes to achieving strategic organizational objectives and who drive significant revenue for the companies that they work for or the associations they work for. And so you have a bunch of young people. They can go do anything. They are stressed out. They are not respected. They are in an industry that regularly has these hiccups that they're not prepared for. So what's to keep them in? How do we retain this talent? How do we not lose them to something that pays better, that is less stressful, that they don't have to work so hard to be recognized for being geniuses? So the idea behind the Next Gen Summit was to get these young professionals in a room together and just listen and let them talk and find out what they care about, what they worry about, where they want to be, what they want to be doing. And then the next step can always be, all right, let's talk about the how. But for this, it was more of a discovery session.
I have to say, because people are not seeing me, but I was nodding very hard. Why should they stay? And we've heard that before at Convening EMEA. There was a next gen person on stage who said, the industry is just not sexy enough for us. So I agree. Yeah. So let's talk about the vision of the Leadership Summit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for the Executive Leadership Summit, that was more focused on, okay, we've got leaders together in a room who actually do have the power to future-proof their business strategy, who can lead an organization, who can, lead their meeting teams, who do have a strategic seat at the table. Let's focus their attention on disruptive scenarios that could happen. So we focused on what are some things that could potentially disrupt the industry within the next 2 to 5 years, and get them in a room together and have them do this table exercise to proactively give some solutions to other people in our industry. So if this scenario, God forbid, comes true, here's a roadmap. Here are some things that we've already thought about that can help you avoid coming to a halt or having to dramatically reinvent the way we do business. So that was the idea behind the Executive Leadership Summit.
And I have to make a comment here. I just can't hold it. But so for once not to be surprised that something happened, because things, like you said, things have happened so many times before. So let's be prepared for once.
Right.
I love that.
Yeah. And so, it ranged from, all right, if we have all these remote workers and there's no one in the commercial office space downtown, consequently, restaurants and other amenities have been closing down because they don't have the people and the customers to support them. If you're a CVB, how do you manage this? How do you show off your town to its best advantage when everyone's working from home? And so that was one. Another one was, there's this no-fly movement has really taken off because the majority of the carbon footprint that's caused by meetings and events is caused by air travel. And so there's this, this boycott of the airline industry, and it's making it hard for people to get to your event or to so what do you do to get around that? And so, or your destination has been passing all sorts of legislation that is not popular. How do you still attract business, or how do you make the case to still meet there? So these were things that we had people that were both on the executive leadership side, as well as people who were business event planners, who were, the heads of meeting departments in conversation. And so there's a combination of scenarios that were from the organizer's perspective as well as from the sales perspective.
And these are very real scenarios. So they are not made up pandemics, but things that are happening in certain
That could happen.
places.
Yeah, absolutely. And we worked with Matt Homan from a company called Filament. He was our facilitator for both sessions. We worked with him and Howard Givner, who is the VP of Education, and we worked with Sheriff Karamat, who is our CEO. And so in conversation, we kind of poked holes in these scenarios. We test drove them. We adjusted them right up into the last moment, just because we wanted them to be real life and we wanted them to be things that were likely to happen sooner rather than later.
And I'm sure the audience was appreciative, because oftentimes in such events, the scenarios are so made up that are hard to picture, even though they realistically can happen. But if they're so hard to grasp, then it's really hard to work out a plan, right?
Yeah.
What were the main takeaways from each of those programs?
Yeah. So the main takeaway was leveraging your relationships that you have, right? So in the case of there being bans, it was, working with your legislatures and working with your customers and really kind of co-crafting messages. And I have seen this coming out more and more because it is more and more of a problem, with nearly half of the states in the United States passing things that marginalize either women or the LGBTQ plus community, or, both. And so it's getting increasingly hard to find destinations that maybe align 100% with your corporate values or your association's values. And so in that scenario, what are ways that you can bring your event to do good while it's in town, as opposed to enforcing this blanket ban on this, and restricting yourself to an increasingly narrow range of acceptable destinations? Is it more does it create a bigger impact and a bigger statement to go to those destinations, to work with partner organizations that are lobbying for change, and to have honest conversations about that impact with city leaders and other people who are in positions to change things and raise awareness and use your money and your visibility to actually be that kind of driver for social and economic change. And so that was one of the solutions that I thought was really interesting. But that kind of partnership and thinking around the box, right? Thinking about, all right, instead of siloing who we are, how can we create greater opportunities for partnership and diversity and increasingly getting comfortable with the uncomfortable idea of we no longer have the luxury of remaining impartial. And there are certain areas where we need to put our stake in the ground and say something. That was also a theme that was dolphining up during that executive leadership summit.
Yeah, very correct. At the end of the day, that's what events are for, right? to bring change in one way or another. A word from our sponsor. Why plan a business event in Kingston, Ontario? Because it's easy to get to and walkable, and for all there is to see, do, and taste. So you save more, connect more, and experience more while you're there. For board meetings, sales retreats, and team building, plan your business event in Kingston. Learn more at visitkingston.ca/meetinkingston. Now back to the program. And these were some of the takeaways from the Executive Leadership Summit. How about the Next Gen Summit?
Yeah, so the Next Gen Summit, Matt Homan worked with a couple of our Next Gen leaders. So there were a couple of young professionals who were in their 20s who co-created what the educational experience would be. And so they also had scenarios. But I think the biggest takeaways from the Next Gen Summit didn't, for me at least, didn't necessarily come from the scenarios they were working with. It came more from things that they talked about that they were wishing and that they were worrying about. There's an exercise at the very beginning which talks about, I wish, I wonder, I worry. And so they were given some time to talk about things that they wished, things that they wondered, and things that they worried about for the industry. And yeah, I mean, we did see a little bit of that, like, this industry is not sexy enough for me, but it's also too, I think more than anything, it wasn't that these were people who wanted to leave. It was more just kind of like, will they ever gain the recognition and the career traction that they need to feel appreciated? Will anyone ever invest as much time and energy into them as they're currently investing in their work? That was a big takeaway. And then the other thing too was this feeling that there are a lot of people who are still in the industry, whereas in generations past might have already cycled out. And that does not create a lot of openings at the top for people to advance. And so what are ways that this next generation, who, by the way, have been here, they're already professionals, like, so they don't necessarily even want to be called next generation or emerging leaders or, anything that sounds chrysalis like. They give them a seat at the table now. If you want to innovate, if you want to change, then look around the room. If everyone looks like you, it's not going to happen. Like, y'all are the ones that got us here. So there were a lot of ideas that involved, hey, instead of having a board of directors that everyone's achieved X to get on this board, why don't you save a couple of spots for us and let us tell you what's going on at the ground floor? And so things like that I found were really, really interesting, cool ideas. And interestingly enough, having some of those young professionals sitting on boards or being a part of the ideation process with the executive leadership team was also an idea that we heard in the executive leadership summit.
Oh, that's great. So there's
Yeah,
some common grounds there.
there is some common ground. And it was really interesting too. And another place where I saw that is that before they left, the executive leaders were asked to write out some advice for this next generation, this youngest generation in the workforce. And so the one piece of advice that really stuck out for me from the executives was meritocracy is a myth. Make sure you establish your network and you find a couple of people who can sponsor you and help you along the way. And then the bookend to that was the next gen audience was asked to write an unreasonable request, right? So something that they may or may not have permission to be asking that they're going to ask anyway. And that's where that kind of like, save us up a couple of seats for us on the board. That's where that one came from. So what I thought was really interesting was that the scenarios were the reason why they were all there. However, the coolest information I felt like came from the margins, came from the ice-breaking exercises, the wrap-up exercises, where people were kind of individually expressing how they felt, as opposed to some of that collective findings, which were still incredibly valuable. So just kind of working through right now with Matt on how best to articulate it and get it in a digestible form. Because then on top of that, we also had this amazing graphic artist who was creating visual snapshots of what was being discussed in real time. So that also is too just such a cool, as people were walking in, them getting to kind of share like and write on the sheets and kind of like see. And then in the Next Gen Summit, we had what the executive leaders had discussed as these graphic snapshots that the 20 and 30-year-olds could kind of like walk by and take a look at and kind of see what was going on. It was really neat.
Great ideas to also have them follow each other in this way. But have you thought of having also a common forum maybe in the future where representatives from, both these age group, they're not even age groups, but places in their career, they can meet and also discuss. Is that kind of what the future of the summits would look like?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I would really love to play with that at EduCon, which we have coming up. I think that'd be really interesting because that is an event that tends to skew towards an audience that is like at that director level or below. And we have a little bit more leeway to do things a bit more experimentally because it's a smaller audience. So it's easier to create things that don't have to accommodate 600 people in a ballroom. So I would love to play with that and kind of figure out some ways to have those conversations because we will have some very senior leaders on the sales side and then the executive leadership from PCMA, absolutely. And then having conversations between our participants with some of these executives, I think could be really, really interesting.
And do you think they'll actually listen? Because it's one thing to have these common forums. It's one thing to have this conversation, behind closed doors. But will there be actions following?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. We had these idea generating sessions at Convening Leaders. I do like to focus on, okay, what's next? Like, how do we, because a lot of times, and that was the challenge that was actually thrown at us when we were organizing Executive Leadership Summit. It's like, are we going to have another meeting where executives sit around and talk about what they think and then nothing happens? And so we went into that planning process being like, no, we're going to come out with these recommendations. We're going to come out with this white paper, this thought leadership that establishes, kind of here's how we can future-proof the industry. So everything that I design is intended to help people act or create change in some way. Otherwise, I don't see what the point of education is. Like, why would you go in and then end the same way? So yeah, so as long as I'm organizing them, there will be some kind of action and takeaway. And hopefully over the course of time, we continue to co-create these roadscapes of where we can go. That's the goal ultimately.
So we'll hold you accountable.
Sure, you can hold me accountable.
So you already mentioned there will be white papers, and as soon as they're out, there will be linked to the show notes so that people have access, because I think there will be a great addition to relate to the industry and help, like you said, move the industry forward to keep it relevant or make it more relevant so that
Right.
the next gen says next time, the industry is sexy enough for us to join.
Yeah, I mean, because everyone jokes about how backwards the events industry is. Everyone. So, hey, everyone who works in the events industry, like, how happy are you about that reputation? If you're not happy about it, guess what? You can change it. And I think it's, one of my favorite people in the events industry who I don't even know if he knows this, was a mentor of mine is Peter Salinger. And like, what he inspired me, I heard him speak, and basically he was an event organizer who decided that sustainability was important, and rather than asking permission or taking months to create the sustainability policy and blah 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 blah, he just started sourcing and designing his events in a responsible way, and then sharing the data on what he was doing. And this was back in like the 80s, right? 80s and 90s. And over the course of a couple of decades, the change that he was able to enact was so seismic that all the industry publications were writing about it. And he was speaking at all these events and being invited to. And then the CEO was like, oh, look what he's doing. And then became kind of a belated sponsor. And then he kind of liked all the press that was happening. But it wasn't like, and it's Pierre. I think I accidentally called him Peter, but it's Pierre. So like, but that was just, and his message to everybody was, you don't have to wait to do things that make good business sense. If it makes good business sense, do it. Find a way. If you care about it, find a way. And that was something that I really took to heart. So when I was at Plan Your Meetings and then later MPI, when I was given the gift of being able to educate people in the meetings and events industry on how to plan meetings and events, I didn't have a separate thing on sustainability. I didn't have a separate thing on strategy. The way I taught people how to create meetings and events, strategy and sustainability was built into the fabric of what your job was. And that's the only way it can happen. Because if you're not thinking strategically and tying every element of your event design back to how it's achieving this objective, then you can't defend all the money you're spending to make this event happen. But if you can say, no, the reason why the AV line item is this large is because if we can't hear and see the speakers, no one's going to remember what we say, right? Or, we have to do this because if we don't, it's going to impact the attendee experience in this way. Like, you have to know that. You can't just be spending money, right? And I think most professionals who have been in the business for any length of time understand that. But how seismic a change is it if every person who's planning a meeting or event from the very beginning is looking at how to reduce the amount of waste, or sourcing things locally, or leaning on the DMO or the tourism organization to help connect them with some kind of organization so that they can partner to do good in the host community, or purchasing what they need to do on site, or recycling or using digital products instead of paper-based products, or booking the meeting so that people can drive or train there instead of having to fly there. Like, those little things are little things. But if it's the way that you do business, then you don't have to relearn anything. And it's not the big hassle that people say that, oh, the climate, sustainability. Like people make it like it's a big deal. And it's honestly, if you build it in from the very beginning, it's just the way you do business. And so that I think was seismic. And so my hope is that in doing things like these conversational circles and summits for executives, for next generation leaders, that we can build off of these no-brainer ideas that are tiny, they're incremental, but when you stack them together, they create seismic change.
Very nice message. I love that. And having said that, if you had a chance, what would you do differently?
Oh, so there were some scenarios that we couldn't touch or that we didn't include because they were incredibly realistic and they might have taken people in a sidebar direction. So, for example, what if there are more conflicts around the world and the US gets dragged into it, right? That's realistic. What would happen? Like, we haven't been a country under war to that degree in 80 something years, like, so what would that do to the economy? We didn't table game a recession. What if there's a worldwide recession triggered by all of these conflicts? So there were some things that I feel like are within the realm of possibility that we didn't explore, that we could have. And in some cases we didn't because it was an international audience. And so, trying to figure out like how much would it impact people, or is that just an American centric thing, right? So we also wanted to be sensitive to that. But I think that no matter where you are in the world right now, it's a very interesting time. And there's probably a lot of doomsday scenarios going through everyone's minds. So there's an element too of just kind of like, how much do we want to be a downer? And how, but I do think ultimately, if you prepare for the worst, then wow, how nice it is when you're pleasantly surprised. As opposed to if you ignore the worst, how your life just collapses under the weight of the unexpected burden. So, yeah, we'll see. I mean, this isn't the last time we're doing it. So maybe we'll push the envelope a little bit further next time, knowing how wonderfully our participants rose to the challenges that we gave them. So,
and honestly, I heard so many good things from different participants within the groups that were invited to the summit, because they were not just open for everybody, and everybody that attended each of them was very pleasantly surprised and took a lot out of it. And wrapping the conversation, was there anything we didn't address and should mention before we finish?
Yeah. So a lot of the discussion and the findings from the Next Gen Summit was information that we took under advisement in the design for EduCon, June 23rd through 26th, 2024. And so I would love for people who have enjoyed this conversation and found it interesting to come out and join us in Detroit and experience some of the programming that was inspired by what our young professionals or people who are working at the director level and below need to succeed in this industry.
Yeah, it will be a very exciting event now that, we know a little bit more about behind the scenes works.
Yeah. And then Convening Leaders in Houston in January of 2025. There will also be probably a continuation of these next generation and executive conversations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kristi, for this conversation. And until next time, and until next conversation, probably after EduCon.
Until next time, thank you so much.
Remember to subscribe to the Convene podcast on your favorite listening platform to stay updated with our latest episodes. We want to thank our sponsor, Visit Kingston. Learn more about why you should hold your business event in Kingston, Ontario at visitkingston.ca/meet in Kingston all together. For further industry insights from the Convene team, head over to pcma.org/convene. Until next time.